So the story starts with a friend who lived in a zoo, and it ended with Paul Gascoigne bringing an ostrich to Tottenham training with us. We are talking about the Paul Gascoigne documentary, of course, some insight into the man, the myth, the legend that is Paul Gascoigne. Colm, Boohig and Ciaran Bradley are on the line with me. Colm, I'll start with you because you have the Paul Gascoigne jersey behind you, the Lazio one, and you almost have his hair as well. It's starting to get more curls every single week.
Yeah, his hair was more kind of an afro perm look, wasn't it?
Yeah.
In the late 1980s with Newcastle United. Like, if I could get into perm status, that's a whole new opening for me. So that's a goal for the rest of the year, definitely.
It was like a perm / mullet, and apparently mullets are coming back, so you could be halfway there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that was one of the many inspirations of this documentary.
Ciaran, you've been called Tommy Ciaran on this show. You've got a bit of curl in your hair as well, so... Like, I mean, is it too late for you to start planting the seed now and get some Paul Gascoigne 1980 hair?
It's funny you say that, actually. My best mate Johnny looks exactly like him. So every time I was watching that documentary and he popped up with that little chubby face, reminding me of him. But no, yeah, Tommy Tiernan, unfortunately, is my doppelganger, so I've been told, actually, by the man himself when I bumped into him in Ranelagh. Got a little selfie, so sure. So yeah, there we are.
You're a fan of that. Right, we'll get into this documentary because it is one of the best ones on Netflix at the minute. There aren't many good football documentaries on Netflix as a whole, so it's nice to actually be able to sit down and watch this at ease when you just turn on Netflix. Colm, we've been chatting about this for the last couple of weeks. He came up in the Bobby Robson documentary. He comes up time and time again when you're talking about English football. Paul Gascoigne is a name that really defines this era of English football.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you just have to say his nickname alone and it conjures up a raft of memories for millions of people, not just in England or the UK, but around the world. And this documentary by Jane Preston, as I was saying, myself and Ciaran were discussing just before we started recording, it's a brilliant overview of Gascoigne, the player and the man during his career. But, you know, when you know Gaz a bit more from his story, you want more and more. And I would have loved if it was more detailed about certain parts of his career. Like, I'm endlessly fascinated by his 3 years at Lazio when Serie A was the best league in the world, and that he stood out when in the brief occasions that he was fit. And what made him so special at Newcastle coming through and made him world-class at Tottenham Hotspur would be great to see. But this is more about the life of Paul Gascoigne. And for every story about, you know, the ostrich prank that you've already alluded to, Enda, and the van prank he does at Spurs, which we'll probably talk about, and there's another legendary prank he does on Gordon Jury at Rangers involving two fish in Jury's car. For all of those brilliant anecdotes, there's also the tragedy in the fact that he was involved in a really tragic incident at a very young age, 10 years of age, babysitting an 8-year-old who tragically died, and then telling, you know, a kid who had asthma that he's okay to play football, and the kid died from an asthma attack. It's stuff that just really followed him around, and he's clearly still in so much pain. And this documentary was made in 2015, but to this day, he carries so much emotional baggage and scars from these events in his life, but still, he's so beloved by so many, and that's why he's endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, look, as someone who has a bit of skin in the game when it comes to Scottish football, Paul Gascoigne isn't exactly the most liked figure in Scotland when it comes to Celtic fans, and I probably shouldn't like him, but I do because he's so vulnerable in that sense. We'll discuss later on why he's actually not liked, because most people know the story already about the pipe celebration, but I just want to focus on the football for now, just in this segment, because his life is endlessly tragic when it comes to it. But on the pitch, Ciaran, this guy was easily one of the best midfielders in the world at that point, if not the best.
Yeah, he was absolutely outstanding. And it's interesting that we kind of have that contrast between his life and football, because I remember someone intimating that for most of the week, footballers are seeing that 90 minutes as their job, whereas Gaz saw it as his kind of free time, his time to express himself, his time to show his extraordinary talent. And he was absolutely superb. And it was obviously crystallised at Italia 90, where he was on the world stage, and just he plays in a manner that you would see something that we said about Wayne Rooney in the past, like someone down the park. I mean, he's just the joy is all across his face, and he just barrels through defences. He's got incredible skill. He loves the confrontation, and he deals with it with a bit of humour on the pitch, but no lack of professionalism. His emotions are always so close to the surface, both in life and in sport. And I was thinking about this last night. I really think that what we see in Gaza is something we kind of like to see in ourselves, be able to express a little bit more, like our vulnerability, our joy, our misery, whatever it may be. And so he was not only one of the best midfielders in the world, but he was a real totem for not only England but also for worldwide football.
Yeah. So, Colm, you mentioned earlier on that you might have wanted to see a little bit more football in this, and it is a good balance in the documentary. But what do you make of Wayne Rooney's couple of appearances in this?
I didn't expect that question. Well, what do you mean? Like, I thought they were nice. I mean, he clearly loves them, and the fact that I think Rooney says at the end, for me, he's by far the best English player ever. And was it the FA Cup semi-final goal, that free kick against Arsenal in 1991, which I think is shown, I counted 5 times in a documentary. Rooney says is the best FA Cup goal ever. I enjoyed it. I mean, it's funny because, in the last 2 documentaries we've discussed, the Nicholas Anelka and Bobby Robson ones, they have a huge number. I mean, they pretty much have a starting 11 of world-class contributors. And Gaza has 3, I think, predominantly, isn't it? It's Rooney, Jose Mourinho and Gary Lineker. So, yeah, to see Rooney pop up, I thought it was more interesting that Mourinho would love him so much. But I can't imagine Mourinho tolerating him as a player. But Rooney doesn't surprise me that much. Well, why? What did you think of Rooney's?
I don't know if you have been reading his pieces for the Times over the last couple of weeks. But all I'm saying is it's a good thing he went into the written word as opposed to the broadcast side of things, because it was the least amount of insight to a person that you could have possibly had. Like there must be an infinite amount of people that could give more insight into Paul Gascoigne than Wayne Rooney. Like Wayne Rooney wasn't part of it. I know he has the stature, but he never played with
Wayne Rooney. You get if you have Wayne Rooney on offer, you bring him in. This is 5 years ago too. He's Manchester United and England captain. So you include him in a documentary, it's going to get more viewers. Surely.
I also think that I think he's kind of like me insofar as he was a touch too young really to remember Gaza like in his proper pomp. I mean, you're kind of going towards Euro 96 where it's really going to have properly made an impression on him. So I suspect that he's watched back a few of the clips beforehand and just sort of, summoned a few things. And obviously he's going off his time at Everton as well, where I'm sure he's going to be starstruck when he's coming through the doors at 11, 12, 13 years old and Gaz there and giving him 40 quid, which apparently he still owes.
Yeah, well, I mean, people don't pay their debts. Just ask Alex Ferguson's brother, Martin, who's still holding a grudge for a couple of pints that they bought in Eastern Europe in one of his early days. So Alex Ferguson is actually someone who features in this as well, because, as people know, there's the famous agreement between Alex Ferguson and Gaza to sign for Manchester United from Newcastle United, but he instead chooses to go to Spurs. Ciaran, your thoughts on that? Does Paul Gascoigne turn into a completely different player if he goes to Man United than going to a Spurs side that were a good enough side but known for being a little bit loose when it came to the off-field activities?
Well, I think that Ferguson has a knack for seeing maverick and, kind of creative genius and sort of letting it flow. So if you look at the likes of Eric Cantona and Cristiano Ronaldo, those types of players, he doesn't really interfere with them. He gives them a little bit more leeway and a little bit more kind of, a less of a tight leash. I think the thing that's always bandied around with Ferguson when it comes to Gaza is, would his off-field activities have changed? No one really knows, obviously, but I suspect it would have ended probably pretty badly. Gaza's kind of wounds in that respect are so deep that I don't think even with the sort of managerial genius that you have in Ferguson, it would have made much of a difference there. I would have absolutely loved to have seen him at Manchester United, but I think, he's got an unusual career path, and I quite like that. I think it adds to this sort of esoteric feeling around Gascoigne. So the way it panned out, I think for me was good enough.
Yeah, and I don't mean to sound as if I'm putting down how good Gascoigne was or how good Glenn Hoddle was, for example, or Gary Lineker. For all of those in their own rights were exceptional talents. But for me, Colm, I don't think Gazza would have stood out as much for Man United as he would have gone to for Tottenham at that stage.
We'll never know. Like, I mean, he might have, because United lacked a lot of creativity at that time. I mean, that was the reason that Fergie took a chance on Eric Cantona when no one else would want him, because they lacked creativity. They had Brian McClare and Mark Hughes, and they needed something else, a bit of spark. And I mean, Gascoigne was the best young midfielder in the country when United tried to sign him from Newcastle in the late 80s. And sure, he finished fourth in the Ballon d'Or reckoning in 1990. So, he'd be worth the punt. Like, whether he would have stood out and have been as indulged as he was by Terry Venables at Spurs, probably not. But as Ciaran's already said, like, Ferguson loved the Maverick, so long as the Maverick adhered to Ferguson's very strict rules. And that would be the question for me. He would stand out in the pitch. Whether Fergie would be able to tolerate him is probably the biggest question, and the one kind of reassuring element for United fans when we did lose out on Gascoigne playing for the club, is that, well, maybe he wouldn't have ever got on enough with Fergie for him to have been there for any considerable period of time. Yeah,
well, I suppose if you look at Alex Ferguson's way of dealing with the likes of Cantona, he probably would have been able to handle Gascoigne. I'm not sure if he would have given him as much rein as other managers would have, given that he went to Tottenham, and then the way that Bobby Robson treated him at England as well. The Tottenham one is an interesting one. It's a good part of this documentary, I thought, when you're getting an insight both to his training, Ciaran, and how he kind of slotted in so well, and was not only because of his exceptional talent on the field, off the field, just being able to make people laugh, helped that Tottenham team on the way to their FA Cup victory.
Yeah, it didn't harm it, absolutely. And I think my mind always goes back to what Bobby Robson says about Gascoigne, where he says, you've got to give him a little clip round the ear, but you've got to give him a hug, and you've kind of got to treat him a little bit differently. And I think people get onto Gazza's wavelength. Like, he kind of drags them there whether they want to or not. Like, it's hard. It's hard not to love him, like, to be around him. I mean, even if you just saw, there's a bit in the documentary, sorry to go away from Spurs for a sec, but when he was talking about talking with the Rangers players just after the Euro 96 draw, and he's giving them stick, and then they're all giving him digs and, pulling his hat down and stuff like that. So he brings out the mischievous side in everyone, and I think that's no bad thing. But I think, it would be to do down the fact that he's an utterly mercurial talent, and he was mesmerising to watch. And he did things that, central midfielders didn't tend to do in that manner. Like, he would just barrel through defences. It's the kind of verb that I always think of with Gazza. Like, he has this such upper body strength, and the lads in the documentary talking about, really in fact was talking about how he kind of uses his arms to keep people away from him without getting booked all the time. And it was absolutely brilliant, I'm sure, as a Tottenham fan to watch that in a period where they were not especially successful, but they did actually have kind of mercurial talents of their own in the past, with the likes of Ossie Ardiles and Glenn Hoddle. So he kind of fitted into a mould in Tottenham in the same way that he probably would have done in Manchester United as well.
Colm, you've got the Lazio jersey behind you. It's not something that features massively in this when it comes to Gascoigne's career. Essentially, it just covers the crazy parts of Lazio where the fans were following him around all the time. That happens. It happened Maradona, and it happened Gascoigne as well. And it's just something that he found incredibly tough to deal with.
Yeah, there's a great documentary, I think it's available on YouTube, of specifically Gazza's time with Lazio, and it's basically an extended interview with James Richardson, the former Gazzetta Football Italia presenter. And it's well worth watching. The Lazio transfer and subsequent madness is so interesting to me, especially because the fee had been agreed between Lazio and Spurs for a long time, and then of course the infamous injury in the FA Cup final in '91 curtailed the move. I think it delayed it by 6 months, and then 3 days before he was due back to full training with Spurs, he goes back up to Newcastle, has a night out, gets attacked in a nightclub, and then it's a further, was it 8 months out? And Lazio still maintained patience, and I think they paid a world record fee to get him in. And he's only there for 3 years, and it's full of injury. But when he plays, when he did play, he was fantastic. There's a goal against Pescara, but it's not in the documentary, where he runs half the pitch. In fact, the only goal that I can think of, but there's 2 goals, is the header in the Rome derby, which made him an all-time hero at Lazio. And then there's a goal against Sevilla where he claims that he and Diego Maradona, who was playing for Sevilla that night, were both severely inebriated playing the match, and Gaza still ran the pitch, or ran half the pitch, half the Sevilla team, and put it into the bottom corner, which he found very funny telling back. And I guess the madness of Lazio kind of encapsulates the life of Paul Gascoigne. And that's why I think I'm so interested by that particular period of time. And also the fact that really, like, his last great moment in football was that goal against Scotland, the Euro 96, and he's only 29 then.
Yeah, and you see it a lot with players of this generation, especially ones like Gascoigne, that burn out so quickly. And I suppose that's sort of what we think of when we think of mavericks of the game, the likes of George Best. Gascoigne is definitely a maverick in that sense, that even though he was so exceptional for so long and on such a high stage, he did it at the World Cup, he did it everywhere he went, there's still that question of, had he not had the injuries, had he not had the problems, would he have achieved much more in his life, Ciaran?
Yeah, well, I mean, when you mentioned Best there, and I was thinking you were talking about kind of mercurial talents and stuff, they have not only problems, I mean, they're chronic alcoholics, and in Gaz's case, substance abuse as well. And that has the obvious impact on not only the physical body, but the mind as well. And like, it's funny, Colm mentioned something there just around the second injury in the Newcastle nightclub, and the way the documentary set up is it kind of like broadly talks about that, then cuts away, and then kind of goes July 1992, Lazio signing. And part of me just wants to go, well, what happened in that 6 months? Talk to him about what happened in that 6 months, because we know he had to sit there for 3 months alone with his legs straight. So we know that he's going to go into booze and who knows what else. So I think this is the one kind of downside, and Colm alluded to it earlier, of the documentary, is that it doesn't really delve too far into the alcoholism and also the domestic violence abuses and charges. So again, not to bring it down too much, but just going back, I think you can actually make a documentary, and they're hopefully looking to do so with this movie now, that brings in stuff like the alcoholism and the substance abuse and the domestic violence, and it doesn't necessarily make Gaza an unlikable figure, because I mean, if we've talked about already, or we will talk about the tragedies in his childhood, so you've got that pushing him from kind of below, then you've got all this unbelievable pressure from the press and from the public, and then you're literally pouring alcohol on top of it. So this is a man who has gone through things that would make everyone's hair curl, and it doesn't necessarily make him in any way dislikable. It was a point within the documentary, I suppose, that just left me a little bit cold, and I think could have done with a little bit more elaboration.
Yeah, and we do obviously want to talk about all those, but we do have to take a short break. If you want to get in touch with the show tonight, text us on 53106, or you can tweet us at Team33. That's all spelled out in words. Let us know what you think of Paul Gascoigne, any of your memories, and just your thoughts on him as well. Stay tuned. Now, welcome back to Team 33. So we are discussing the Paul Gascoigne documentary. Ciaran Bradley and Colm Boohig are on the line with us. Remember, you can text us on 53106 if you want to get in touch with the show, or you can tweet us at Team 33, and you can also podcast this on the OTB Sports app now, available in the Google App Store or Play Store as well. So, Ciaran, you mentioned it before the break, and it's something that we can't ignore when we're talking about the Paul Gascoigne story. He's a man that is deeply damaged by things that have happened in his career. there are parts of his life that he will want to forget for various different reasons. Some of his own wrongdoings, also some that were completely unavoidable. The first one, this isn't really dealt with too much in the documentary overall, the alcoholism, the substance abuse, but one thing that they do talk about is the first moment of Gascoigne dealing with death, and that is at 10 years old when he's babysitting or taking his friend's little brother to a football match, and he is hit by an ice cream truck and killed on the spot. And he couldn't get away from the fact that it was he blamed himself for that.
I can't think of a more traumatic experience that a human being, let alone a 10-year-old child, could go through than this. Having a child die in your arms after an accident that, in your mind, you caused to some degree, is just the most psychologically damaging thing that could ever happen to somebody. And I was thinking about this when I was sort of thinking about the fact that they don't cover the stuff like domestic violence and things like that. Someone close to me in my family is a psychotherapist, and is obviously, you know, a lot of that is to do with childhood and the kind of psychological damage that's caused then. Like, you're starting from 10 steps back in any way of like socialising yourself properly. So it's absolutely no surprise that Gazza's not only drinking socially, but I mean, he says it in the documentary himself, that he's drinking at home and he gets dark and depressed and in a hole. And I think it's what Russell Brand actually on Soccer AM, I think a few years back, kind of was sitting next to Gazza, and I think he put it better than I've heard anyone talk about it with Gazza, is that he kind of has this little, he's cracked, but like that's where his genius shines through. And I think that Gazza fits into this kind of oeuvre of kind of damaged, troubled, creative, you know, geniuses, or whatever you want to call it. And like, I mean, it is unbelievably harrowing listening to it. And it was interesting because he immediately kind of talks about going into therapy, and then he says, oh, you know, I was with the psychotherapist very early on, and then he has a little smile to himself, and I was like, that's kind of how he deals with it with other people. Like he makes a little bit of a sense of humour he makes a little bit of a joke of his vulnerability, but it's ultimately so endearing, and it's just so awful seeing someone deal with something like that, and you have this utter hopelessness, and there's nothing you can do about it. The fact, I mean, he's talking, sorry, I don't mean to ramble on, but when he's talking about being at the wake and being without sleep for 3 days, sitting next to this poor lad's coffin, and to the point where the boy who's passed away, his brother, comes in and says, Paul, you know, it's all right, it'll be all right. So to have the tables turned in that situation where someone who's grieving is you know, helping his friend was really touching as well. It's just unbelievably difficult and illuminating watch, and it really set the scene for the majority of the rest of his life, and it's unbelievable TV.
Yeah, Colm, that bit about the sitting in the room for 3 days after the kid's death with his coffin, that really hit home for me.
Oh, it's unbelievable. I mean, I knew the story about the death and how it happened, but I actually had forgotten about that coffin story until I watched back the documentary last night. I think Ciaran and myself have seen it the same number of times. I think it's about 3 times, but I had completely forgotten about that, which is, Jesus, like that's equally as damaging long-term for your mental health as the actual incident itself. And I think the asthma one too was, you know, that's terrible, because he was just doing good by what he thought by advising the young kid. Of course you can play football like everybody else. Of course you can. Just be careful. And then the footballer died. Sorry, the young person died. But it's terrible. And I guess that's why, I mean, I don't know. Like the question is, was he born that way anyway? Even if he had a really comfortable and lovely and incident-free upbringing, would he still have turned out to have the issues that he did? But he said he did develop a twitch in the aftermath of that tragedy with the babysitting incident, and his sister would mock him over it, and that would increase the amount of twitching he did. And so I suppose that was circumstantial, and I guess what it developed in Gaza was he became a man of contrasts. I mean, you know, in March 1997, his wife filed for divorce, citing domestic abuse, and there's the imaginary flute celebration on his Rangers debut against Steaua Bucharest. And he did it again. He did it in January 1998, just before he left the club when he scored against Celtic. So he, in the documentary, he says that, like, I learned my lesson. I was never going to do that again because I was receiving death threats from the IRA for 6 months after the initial incident. But he did it again. But then there's the other side of him where he would regularly leave, massive tips and news agents, like £50 or £100 to give kids sweets. And there's a story that, the Rangers players would go to hospital at Christmas time, like so many footballers do. And he was speaking to one kid who wasn't going to get home for Christmas, and he asked him, have you written your letter to Santa? And the kid said no. So Gaza sat down with him and wrote the letter with the kid, and then went out and bought all the presents that he had put in the list. So he was this unbelievably kind and lovely person who was really flawed. And I guess he is all of us. He is every man, but he's even more than most people in terms of his vulnerability. And most people have some sort of filter or some sort of defense mechanism, and he doesn't appear to have any, which is probably what made him such a good footballer. I mean, he says in the documentary that the only time he really felt free, especially when the press started invading his life, which pretty much happened from autumn 1990 to the present day, the only time he felt free was out on the pitch, which is when Gary Lineker says he was never afraid to try anything because the easiest part of his life was football, even at the highest level.
Yeah, and throughout his career, there's multiple instances. Like in 2004, his book came out, his autobiography, and he spoke about his struggles with, he had OCD, he had bulimia, he had depression, he had Tourette's, multiple mental health issues that weren't dealt with, and certainly weren't helped by alcoholism, Ciaran, which you've spoken about. It's something with this period of footballers. Many people have come out and spoke from that generation, from the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s generation of footballers, struggled with alcoholism throughout their career and didn't get any help.
Gaz, certainly fits into that mould. It was such a heavy drinking culture, and so much more laddie than I suppose we would have now in general. It reminded me actually of when Merson was talking, I think in his autobiography, about when Tony Adams stood up in front of the Arsenal dressing room and said, "Look, I'm an alcoholic," and he'd obviously crashed his car and been through many scrapes along the way. And Merson said that he thought, or I think he said out loud, "Well, if you're an alcoholic, what am I?" And he was an alcoholic as well. It's just that, like, it's kind of it was hidden in plain sight because everyone was such heavy drinking kind of people. And Gary Lineker being kind of front and centre of this documentary made me think that Gary Lineker was one of the cleaner living footballers by that standard, like by that day's standard. Whereas now it wouldn't particularly stand out. In fact, possibly he'd be kind of further down the queue in terms of healthy living. But it was in a way, it was a double-edged sword for Gaza because, like, it was socialising where he's at his best. It was, he had good friends. Like, I mean, he talks about Vinnie Jones in the documentary. He talks about, Gary Lineker and him were obviously close. Any number of other players, Ali McCoy, I know, is very close with Gaza too. There were people looking out, or rather, there are people looking out for him now, and I'm sure that they enjoyed the socialising element with Gaza, but also they recognise the vulnerability. Bobby Robson as well, obviously, as we spoke about during his documentary. Gaza would say that people come up to him in the street and say, "How you doing, Gaza?" And he'd be like, "Oh, so Bobby sent you." There's one offshoot to this that I just wanted to touch on, was when he's talking about the phone hacking scandal with News of the World. And he is having phone calls with only his mum about a subject and only his dad, right? And he's in a bad state and he's drinking too much and he's doing too much coke and stuff like that. And these stories get into the press and it sets off his paranoia, which ultimately ends up getting him sectioned. Like, you don't really need to elaborate on how abhorrent a situation that was, but just trying to get yourself into the mind of someone like Gaza, who is vulnerable enough, as we've said a number of times, but is convinced that his phone is being hacked and is sectioned under the Mental Health Act because he's making these paranoid accusations in inverted commas. And I mean, when you have that kind of pressure on you, it's no wonder that he went off the rails to the extent that he did. It's not excusing all of his actions, of course, but it's just it was a hard situation for him to be growing up in and coming of age as a footballer.
Do you know what I'm interested in and just wondering is he has such a big support network around him, and people look after him and care for him. Pretty much every team he played for looks out for him in some way these days. Do you both think that he would still have that support network if he wasn't such a great player? Because he provided so many great memories on the pitch.
I think... sorry, go ahead.
It's hard to know. There are so many players from that generation that have had issues and have come out and have been abandoned by the authorities. Yeah. So, I mean...
His talent helped him,
In some ways, they've tried and they just haven't been successful in the sense. But I would probably agree. There would be a sense of that anyway. I don't know what you think, Ciaran.
Yeah, I think that in general, across the board, you have a certain kind of concentric circles of friends. So you would have your close friends that would be looking out for you regardless. And I think that the fact that he got to know a lot of these people through football meant that they were probably in a similar situation, i.e. that they were famous and stuff themselves. So it's not necessarily as stark a contrast, i.e. he's an excellent player. I think he has this obvious charm about him. He has this obvious ability to kind of, worm his way into your heart, I suppose, and that really is it. To be honest with you, I said earlier that there are people looking out for him now. It would be interesting to get Gaz's thoughts on exactly how many people that is and who is constantly checking in with him, particularly the likes of Bobby Robson has passed. So, yeah, it is an interesting question, but obviously, not sure myself.
Well, I suppose one answer to that is that it was 2015 before Gaza was actually diagnosed with alcoholism when this documentary came out this year. At age 33, after all of this had happened. And alcoholism is one of these things where it can take over your life in many ways, but I can't see past the role that the News of the World played in all of this, like you said, because you have all of these issues, the underlying issues with the multiple deaths that he feels that he played a role in. There was also an incident in 2016 with his nephew when his nephew took his own life as well. And in one way or another, Gaza blamed himself for that. And also the domestic violence issues with his ex-wife in 2010. But all of this was all combined with the fact that he didn't know if his own life was reality or not because of what was coming out in the papers. And another point in this I would like to add in the sort of the post-documentary phase of this is that the press haven't learned their lesson from this. There's no evidence that they're still hacking phones, but I do feel in modern days press, tabloids, there is still a situation out there where people relish when Paul Gascoigne goes off the rails again, because that's a story for them as well, Ciaran.
There's a skirting between total amorality and total immorality with, I'm going back now with the News of the World. His situation was known by certainly everyone in the press, i.e. his alcoholism and substance abuse issues, and yet they continued in this manner. I mean, look, what can you say? It's despicable. It's just the fact that it crystallised in such an awful way with Gaza that he started questioning his own thoughts, which were obviously, he was questioning at every turn anyway, and it's unbelievable. And look, obviously with the likes of Caroline Flack and the treatment of the tabloid media of certain people in the public eye and the fallout from the Leveson inquiry, has much changed? I'm probably not, to be honest. Ultimately, people know that if a Gaza story's in there, they're either viewing it as a kind of with a serious pathos and I hope you get well soon, or a kind of grim rubbernecking. And I personally actually went, as we were talking about this documentary, went to look at the Real Moat stuff, and I couldn't really watch more than sort of 20 or 30 seconds. I know we all probably had some form of laugh around that time, just thought, how mad is this? But then you just view it in your kind of more sober moments and just think this is just a total mental breakdown that's happening here. And the press has to carry a significant portion of the blame for that. Yeah,
they definitely do. Colm, I do want to finish on a positive note. Gaza is someone that you can look at it in two ways. You can look at his many, many faults, but ultimately he was an exceptional talent that when you watch him purely on his football, he is an absolute joy to watch.
Yeah, and I don't think we're going to see the likes of him again at such a high level of the game. Actually, one of my favourite scenes in the whole documentary, and it's about 2 seconds long, is they actually show some build-up play by him in the FA Cup semi-final between Spurs and Arsenal in 91, where he swivels in the middle of the pitch and finds his man. And I was like, that's what I want to see more of, because that's how good he was. And what I really love about him as a player was that despite all the troubles off the field, he just felt completely open to express himself on it. And he was so good at doing that the best clubs in the world were after him, and the clubs that did acquire him paid record fees for him a number of times in a row. And even like Wayne Rooney says it in a valid contribution, Enda. Wayne Rooney says even at Everton you could see his talent, you could see his ability, and that was in like the early 2000s when he was way past it. So like a fabulous player, and I think the reason that we're still talking about him 20 years after he finished up playing, or nearly 20 years, is that I haven't really seen someone similar to him. I think there was a bit of Jack Wilshere about him. Jack Wilshere was kind of similar to him about 10 years ago when he came through, but even then, quickly that became apparent that he's no Gaza. And so people show flashes, but nobody to his level. So that's why we're still talking about him. That's why he's still relevant.
Yeah, it's not so much what Rooney said, it's just the way that he said it. It was just... Well,
you can still say interesting things. And also, he was the guy in the documentary who said he used his upper body very well, and it was a skill. He's the best contributor in this podcast.
Also, Rooney is the person that I think reminds me of most of Gaza and did when he burst on the scene as well. He's got that kind of bullish, I know it's a different position obviously, but he just had that physique and that just total joy as well. It's amazing.
Without being cruel about it, both of them shared one similarity, and that was their body type. They were overweight, essentially, is what I'm saying. Gaza was told it in his career throughout. He just needs to lose a bit of weight and he'll be perfect. Like you call it upper body strength. I call it I don't know, just hard to shift.
They said it to Gaza in a puppy dog kind of way, but they castigated Rooney. That was the difference.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Luke Shaw has a similar stature to him. He's also hard to put off the ball.
But there's going to be no documentary about Luke Shaw in 20 years' time.
No, I don't think so. On a serious note, if you have been affected by anything spoken about in the programme today, the Samaritans are available on 116 123. Lads, that's all we have time for on the show tonight. Thanks for joining us.
Cheers, Enda.
We'll take a quick break.